Regarding Atlantis, there are far too many authors who claim to know its fate and its history. The vast majority of them, when writing on Atlantis, are fabricating stories, or at the very least highly misinformed. As such, I've only included information in this video from authors whose accounts were backed up by at least one other author. Both Valerie Bonwick and W. Scott Elliott placed the start of the Atlantean root race at around 2 million years ago. If you have watched the previous video on root races, you will notice that the time for the existence of each root race has been shrinking. The Lemurian root race lasted close to 12 million years, but the Atlanteans only lasted for at most 2 million. This can in part be explained by the average life expectancy of the members of each race. Lemurians could potentially live for over 1,000 years. The average Atlantean lived for 300 years. Races have also been shrinking in stature, precisely halved for each new root race. Hyperboreans were roughly 120 feet tall, Lemurians 60 feet, Atlanteans 30 feet. While different Atlantean subraces varied to some extent, the average Atlantean had tan or olive skin color, especially in the latter days of Atlantis. Like the latter-day Lemurians, Atlanteans reproduced as we do today. W. Scott Elliott claims that all aspects of matter and the atmosphere were less dense during the Atlantean epoch. This caused fires to burn taller, planes to glide across the air with ease, and ships to be more buoyant. Samuel Onweor has said that the atmosphere during this time was much different. Geothermal activity near the surface of the ocean floor was at an all-time high, causing large quantities of water vapor to steam off the surface of oceans all across the world. The atmosphere was so infused with water that early Atlanteans prior to the first flood had an organ similar to gills in order to survive breathing on the surface. These gills developed into lungs after the first flood. According to both Valerie Bonwick and Gurdjieff, many off-planet entities made Earth their home during the early days of the Atlantean root race, in particular, beings from the planet Mars. According to W. Scott Elliott, the early subraces of the Atlantean root race did not have the highly developed capacity for logical reasoning that we have today. The potential for advanced mathematical calculation and processing of logical syllogisms was something that had to develop within the minds of the Atlanteans during this period, and continued much further during the present root race. What the early Atlanteans lacked in reasoning, they made up for with an impeccable memory. An Atlantean would be able to remember at once every experience they had throughout the course of their lifetime. Rather than trying to figure out new solutions to the problems they encountered, they would consider how similar situations had worked out in the past. They would then apply those old experiences to present situations. Advanced theorizing about possibilities was out of the question for them. But they made up for this with an immense curiosity and willingness to experiment. Experimentation was seen as a way of acquiring new experience. In short, Atlanteans couldn't make a hypothesis, but were capable of saying, "I wonder what will happen when I do this," and then learning from the experience. Atlantean technological progress was much slower than our own, but reached higher heights even during the early parts of their root race's existence due to the immense amount of time given to their race. It is also likely that they had fewer setbacks or dark ages. Imagine what would have happened to our race if the Middle Ages had Rome's running water, or if the library at Alexandria had not been destroyed. Regardless, learning many things did not matter as much to the Atlanteans as having a great deal of experience. Atlantean elders were revered for having lived through so much. The first 4 sub-races of the Atlantean root race also had another distinct advantage. While their use of mental energy was not fully developed, they had an immense capacity for interacting with raw natural life force energy. This gave them the ability to commune with and control the elemental spirits of nature. During the first 3 subraces, this ability was used mostly for benevolent means, but during the 4th, it took a much darker turn. Thanks largely in part to the writings of W. Scott Elliott, Helena P. Blavatsky, Samuel Onweor, and to a lesser extent Gurdjieff, we still have accurate details of the 7 Atlantean subraces and approximate times for the 4 Atlantean ages. I wanted to include a section on this in the video for the Lemurians, but every source I encountered disagreed on the names and history of the Lemurian subraces, so it is safe to say that that information has been lost to time. Thankfully, the knowledge of the Atlantean subraces is still for the most part well intact. There are some disagreements, but for the most part it isn't too difficult to come to a general consensus. The Rmoahals are the first subrace of the Atlantean root race. I will put spellings of these names in the video description. They started on a small island near the main body of the early Atlantean continent, demarcated by the number 1. This land is what survived the destruction of Lemuria. The Rmoahals were a mixture of beings brought to Earth for the start of a new race, and the best survivors of the old Lemurian race. Since the Lemurians were a primarily dark-skinned people, the Rmoahals had a much darker complexion than the other Atlantean subraces. They reached their height during Atlantis' golden age, meaning that greed, strife, and war were unheard of. They lived in a utopian monarchical society. They worshipped the sun, and they had an extreme reverence for the dead. Ancestors were not worshipped, but they were highly esteemed. The Rmoahals were more nomadic than the other subraces, and lived simple lives very close to the earth. While the Rmoahal people called their leaders kings, they were more like tribal chiefs of a dignified people. During later epochs, the remnants of the Rmoahal people did engage in wars with the 6th and 7th root races, as their people were often pushed aside when new subraces came into prominence in the regions the latter-day Rmoahals were occupying. The Tlavatlis were the 2nd subrace. They began their era of prominence in Atlantis' Golden Age and ended their prominence during the beginning of the Silver Age. They initially lived on the island marked by the number 2 on the map west of the main Atlantean continent, although later during their prominence settled on the mainland. While there, they preferred to live in the more mountainous regions of the continent, both during and after their time of prominence. Their skin color was a reddish-brown, and they were an exceptionally strong and hardy people. These Atlanteans developed some of the most advanced technology of this root race. They were in contact with extraterrestrial entities and developed cosmic ships that utilized atomic energy. The Toltecs were the 3rd Atlantean subrace, and reigned during the latter half of the Silver Age and into the Copper Age. They started out at the point demarcated by the number 3 on the map. Since it was no longer the Golden Age, the Toltecs did encounter some troubles. As mentioned in previous videos on root races, borders and wars do not exist prior to a root race's Copper Age, but some societal issues did occur for the Toltecs. One mistake the Toltecs made was introducing the notion of hierarchical succession. Prior to the Toltecs, all kings over tribes or kingdoms chose the wisest among them to be their leader. The Toltecs began the practice of honoring people for the deeds of their ancestors. So bloodline succession became the norm, even if the successor was unfit to rule. Like the Tlavatlis, the Toltecs had reddish-brown skin color, and they also had rather persistent genetics. Later on, when the Toltecs intermarried with people of future and previous subraces, the children would still look mostly Toltec. The word Toltec means builder or mason, and it was the Toltecs who primarily cultivated the practice of building pyramids. They created large cities, and at their height spanned the entirety of the Atlantean continent for thousands of years. The Rmoahals and Tlavatlis, being sensible and peaceful at this time, simply moved out of the way for the Toltecs. They saw that the Toltec civilization was flourishing, and for the most part gave way to allow them to progress. The Rmoahals kept moving as they were a nomadic people anyway, and the Tlavatlis stayed in the mountainous region since they preferred it there, while the Toltecs preferred flat expanses of land on which to build their cities. The Toltecs were the ones who built the famous city of the Golden Gates. The city was so well constructed and maintained that it lasted thousands of years until Atlantis started flooding. Some have claimed this city stood until the final sinking of Atlantis. In actuality, there were a total of 7 cities of the Golden Gates, built at various locations across the continent during the Toltecs' reign of dominance. The Toltecs are still remembered in the mythologies of native people in Central America. Quetzalcoatl, who is remembered in mythological form as a feathered serpent, was actually a leader and savior of the Toltec people. Subraces past the Toltecs tended to have a more tan skin color. Many people of both the Toltec and the Tlavatli races fled to the Americas as those lands became available. The Turanians were the 4th root race. The Turanians had their start in the area demarcated by the number 4 on the eastern side of the continent, just south of the mountainous region inhabited by the Tlavatlis at this time. The dates on the end of the Copper Age are unclear, but one thing is certain: the Turanians ushered in the Iron Age, or Kali Yuga, as it is referred to in Hindu traditions. They were by far and away the worst of all the Atlantean subraces. As one author put it, they were especially vile in their abominable selfishness. They erected temples where the kings were worshipped as gods, and caused the extreme oppression of the helpless lower classes. Black magic of the worst and most nauseating kind flourished, and all their efforts were directed towards the gratification of vanity and external display. So not the friendliest of neighbors. Some of the best Turanian cities were the ones they captured from the Toltecs. They never really took over the entirety of the continent of Atlantis as the Toltecs did, partly due to fracturing in their power structures as various rulers sought to keep more power for themselves, partly due to the formidability of the Toltecs. The Turanians, and those people of other subraces who followed in their practices, did control the entirety of the island of Atlantis in its latter days, after it had shrunk considerably in size. At this time, the first of 4 major flooding events took place on the continent of Atlantis, and this is sometime around 800,000 BC. This cataclysm took place after a great war between white and black magicians. I detailed the battle between the white master Moria and the black master Orhuarpa in the Black Magicians of Atlantis video. Now, with each of these flooding events, land sinks away from Atlantis. The continent becomes smaller, and lands rise on other continents for new subraces and root races to later inhabit. With each flooding, soil quality decreases, crops do not grow as abundant as they once did, and more land becomes swamp. So those who survived the first flood had much less to work with. Before I switch maps, I want to point out the H that is on an island in what would later become Northern Europe. These are the Hyperboreans. Right now they are leaving Atlantis to handle its own affairs, but they will be coming into play shortly. Alright, so the people of the 4th subrace used their witchcraft and sorcery to hypnotize and control the subjugated masses, as well as the simple-minded people of other races, as I have already detailed all of this there. The Turanian people of Turkey, the Middle East, and Siberia, of the modern root race, are related to these Turanians, but they are the ancestors of the minority of Turanians who disagreed with the practices of their fellow men on Atlantis, who left at various points during Atlantis' timeline. The Aztecs were also a distant offshoot of the Turanians. While at first their people were a noble race who brought to light many great mysteries, they eventually succumbed to the same pitfalls as their Atlantean ancestors, namely barbarism, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. The Semites, or Shemites, were the 5th subrace of Atlantis. The story of Noah's Ark is part allegory and part history. The historical aspect refers to the story of how the people who would soon become the Shemites left Atlantis after the evils committed by the 4th root race. They had full knowledge of the event before it happened, as it was foretold by many seers. This would perhaps be the best time to mention the Akkadian Society. The Akkadian Society was a mystery school that studied the elemental forces of nature. They were a brotherhood of white magic that began on the island of Atlantis. It is unclear during which subrace they came into being, but it was most likely sometime during the third or fourth subrace's period of dominance. They remained an influential force throughout the remainder of the Atlantean epoch. Notably, they built the Sphinx, and maintained the knowledge of pyramid building for the purposes of accumulating positive energy. They were the ones who warned those who deserved to know about the impending floods on Atlantis. At the end of the Atlantean epoch, they passed their knowledge on to the people of Tibet, as well as to the people who would later be known as the Mayans. They also set up the mystery schools of Egypt, which lasted thousands of years and taught the likes of Moses, Pythagoras, and Jesus. The fifth subrace was formed by mixing the blood of Turanians, who had not succumbed to the temptations of black magic, with the descendants of the Hyperboreans, who had kept themselves hidden during the Lemurian epoch. You can see the fifth subrace's starting point at the number 5 on the map. These are the distant ancestors of the modern Jewish people. They mark a major shift according to some authors in the way that people thought. As mentioned earlier, Atlanteans valued memory as the primary mental function. Reasoning and theorizing became a more prominent feature of the Shemite race. Prior to this time, all Atlanteans had the ability to see and communicate with the elemental spirits of nature. Some did this to the great benefit of mankind. For example, a person of the Toltec race could ask an earth elemental where to find gold, or orichalcum to build their temple. Others used elementals for the purposes of great destruction. For example, the Turanians, using their black magic, could force a fire elemental to light a rival village or city on fire. As a consequence for these terrible acts, all people beyond the fourth subrace lost their power to see and interact with elementals as an innate ability, in place of further developed logical reasoning. Now, many people of the fifth, sixth, and seventh subraces regained these lost abilities through the practices taught by the Akkadian Society, but for the most part these abilities were lost to the average person who remained on Atlantis. The Shemites were the polar opposite of the Turanians. At one point, the Shemites forbade their people from intermarrying with the Turanians due to their proclivity towards black magic. The people of the fifth subrace developed a strong sense of conscience. The Shemites had to struggle immensely to undo the damages of the previous subraces, and these struggles are referred to in an allegorical manner in the early books of the Torah and Old Testament. After the second flood, Atlantis had been split into 2 smaller islands, Ruta and Daitya. H.P. Blavatsky is the only author to comment on these islands, stating that the people on them were giants, and for the most part, powerful black magicians. A group existed on these islands known as the Lords of the Dark Face. She also states that some of the people of Ruta were the ones to break off and form Egypt. The sixth subrace is referred to as the Akkadian or Arcadian subrace. In truth, both the Arcadians and Akkadians were part of this subrace. They are just one race that occupied the area around the region that would later become the Mediterranean Sea. People in southern Europe remember them as the Arcadians, and people in the Middle East as the Akkadians. These are not exactly the Akkadians of the ancient world of our modern root race, but the Atlantean Akkadians are the distant ancestors of the Akkadians of the modern era. The people of the sixth subrace are the direct descendants of the fifth subrace. The ancient Greek poet Homer references the Arcadians in the Odyssey. According to him, Arcadia was a land of dryads, nymphs, and other spirits. It was also the home of the god Pan. If we are to take Homer's account seriously, then the Arcadians of the Atlantean root race built a utopia both physically and spiritually for themselves. They were the ancient ancestors of the Greeks. Based on the information given to us by Plato, it is safe to assume that the Arcadians fought against the Turanians at some point, or quite likely at many points in their history, stopping their advance in an attempt to take over the lands that would eventually become Europe and Asia. So the only Iron Age hardships for the Arcadians were the wars caused by the Turanians and other previous subraces. It is possible that some people of the sixth root race were destroyed at some point by the cataclysm that sank Atlantis, and were not warned due to atrocities committed in wartime. The Platonic dialogues at least state that some of the ancient Greeks living in this region were wiped out by flooding. The Mongolians were the seventh subrace. Despite being the most recent of the Atlantean subraces, several authors have rather different takes on their history, or have no history mentioned at all, so it's hard to define much about their existence. They had their start where the number 7 is currently placed on the map. As the ocean in this region receded, these people made their homes on what would later become the Gobi Desert. At this point in Earth's history, that region is a lush forest. The Mongolians were also the direct descendants of the Shemites, though some authors have asserted that they were a mixture of Shemite and Turanian blood. Though this is incorrect, because the decree made by the Shemites that their people were not to mix blood with any of the Turanian people lasted until the end of the Atlantean epoch. These are also the distant ancestors of the modern Mongolian people, as well as the ancestors of most other Eastern Asian peoples. They were the only subrace to have no contact with the continent or island of Atlantis. They were skilled in music, being proficient in the skill of herding and controlling the movement of animals by singing, and this practice has been passed down to the rural Mongolian people of modern times. Much more is known about what became of the seventh subrace of Atlantis, as they will become the foundation for the first subrace of the Aryan root race, and we will discuss that in a later video. The fourth map provided by W. Scott Elliott has a few points of note. After the third flooding in 80,000 BC, Dacia has sunk, and Ruta has shrunk further into the island nation of Poseidonis. This is the land to which Plato refers in his dialogues. Poseidonis was the mountainous region on all previous Atlantis maps, so after the third great flooding period, Atlantis has sunk so far that only the once massive mountainous regions are above sea level. At this point, the Americas are fully developed. There are only two other points of interest on this map. The first is the giant gap in northern Africa. I would think that after the final sinking of Atlantis, this gap closes for the most part, but the Nile River is left well intact as a smaller version of the channel that appears currently on this map. The writings of Edgar Cayce discuss how the Nile used to flow from east to west, flowing into the Atlantic Ocean, and satellite imagery of this region confirmed the existence of a historic waterbed that flows in that direction. The second point of interest is the Himalayas and Plateau of Tibet, or rather, the lack thereof at this time. Prior to the final sinking of Atlantis, this region was first a sea as we saw on the previous map, and then a great lake as we see now. But after the sinking of Poseidonis, this region rises up to become the overall highest region above sea level on the planet. This notion is also supported in the writings of Gurdjieff, who claim that this mountainous region rose up rather suddenly. As far as overall technological progress, Atlanteans used both nuclear and solar technology at their height. Overall, their air and naval crafts were far more impressive than ours. In the modern era, we have nuclear-powered submarines that can remain submerged without needing to refuel. The only concerns in terms of resupplying are making sure the crew has enough food, water, and other provisions. The Atlanteans had nuclear submarines, but also had nuclear-powered aircraft. The Atlanteans also mastered anti-gravity, and with the aid of a small technological device, could render any object weightless. The last days of Atlantis were bleak. Nuclear wars, cannibalism, and dark occultism reigned supreme across the majority of the populace. The descendants of the Turanians had control over the last remaining land on the island of Atlantis, and there were people born of the other subraces on the island, but they had also fallen in league with the Turanians' depravity, although many people of other races were kept by the Turanians as slaves. Once again, many pieces of Atlantean technology are discussed in the Black Magicians of Atlantis video, so I'll provide an end screen to that at the end of this video. In addition to what is said there, I will add that the Atlanteans had a technological device that could materialize any mental image. It has been said that any well-developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. In this case, an ability that was once reserved for powerful black magicians like Rmoahal were put into the hands of everyday people. The most perverse Atlanteans would use this device to create demonic monstrosities that they would sustain by feeding their own blood, or the blood of their enemies. It is possible that many of the strange cryptids that are fodder for urban legends all around the world are beings created by this device that survived the final flood. I will also repeat that the science of the late Turanians prior to the final flood was frightfully powerful and destructive. They were able to bind the souls of elementals to machinery in order to create intelligent androids to fight and perform menial labor. These androids looked human, but were powered by an animal level of intelligence.